Tuesday for this. I was as I wrote, I was trying to find a good classic movie on Netflix, and there isn't that many before 1980, which is interesting because Netflix has this big Hollywood series about old Hollywood, and there's no movies from that era. But this is one of my favorite Westerns, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I'm glad everybody voted on it. So I thought I would just talk about it for a few minutes and sort of share my thoughts, and then would love to hear what you think about it. I hope you get a chance to watch it if you haven't already. It's a hefty movie, 2 hours 45 minutes, and that's the international cut, or the international cut. The regular one runs about 3 hours. But I guess I'll start with a quote I read in Film Comment magazine about this movie. Actually, I think it was about Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns in general, which says that they're like operas, except that the arias aren't sung, they're stared. And I think that's particularly true of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, which begins with this outlaw's ugly mug, an extreme close-up, staring straight at you into the camera, and then ends with the infamous three-way shootout, which is like the greatest staring contest in cinematic history. I think these movies are best viewed as like operas. I mean, you don't come to them for gritty realism of what the Old West was like. You often don't come to them for plot continuity or realistic characterizations at all. They're over the top in every way, from the violence to the characters to the plots, especially in Good, the Bad, the Ugly, which is this incredible plot that just keeps going on and keeps, even of course the camera work from these gigantic, gorgeous vistas of what ends up being Spain rather than subbing in for the American West. And then, of course, these amazing close-ups of these actors who are a mix of recognizable American actors and European actors, and it seems like just locals who were picked by Sergio Leone because they looked really good on screen, and it makes for these really almost surreal westerns that I think are just so entertaining. And they made hundreds of spaghetti westerns. We really only know the Sergio Leone ones. I mean, there are some by Carbucci and stuff that cinephiles maybe know more of, but it's the Leone ones that everybody knows about. And these movies were made, as I said, by European directors, mostly Italians, although not always, and very much on the cheap in Spain. The first Clint Eastwood one, Fistful of Dollars, was made for about $250,000 in 1964. Eastwood at the time was considered a failed TV actor who had not made the transition into movies in the United States. So apparently the story was that he had never seen Spain and Italy, and here was a way to do that. So he got paid $15,000 to make Fistful of Dollars, which was not released in the United States at the time, and neither was the follow-up next year for a few dollars more. But there were huge hits in Italy and Europe, and that was enough for Leone to call over to Italy a couple of American producers to a screening of a few dollars more in Italy to show them, like, these are very successful movies. You should get in on this. And so the Americans ended up financing The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is why it's such a bigger scope than the first two movies, especially like those Civil War scenes towards the end where you have hundreds of extras, and it's just a whole other level of filmmaking. And apparently they came up with the idea sort of that night. The writer was there and just hit on the idea of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He said he could see it on the poster, and then they sort of, wrote the story about these three characters, all on not parallel, but certainly overlapping journeys to find this fortune in Civil War gold. And they're off to the races. And Eastwood initially was not interested in coming back for a third one, or he was reluctant, but they knew they needed to have him back. Part of the deal was the Americans had wanted to sell all three movies to international and U.S. audiences as sort of a package, which is how they came up with the idea of calling Clint's character the man with no name, even though he clearly has a name in all three of these movies. He's Blondie in this one. He's Joe in A Fistful of Dollars, and I can't remember the second one. But the idea was to have this, this mythos around Eastwood, who had perfected this, I guess we call it minimal style of acting, this eerie calm with all these crazy characters around him, especially in this movie. But Clint was a little reluctant to do this movie, partly because he was reluctant to share screen credit. And in this movie, he's one of three main characters instead of the hero, like he was in the last two. And there's a quote I guess he gave where, like, this keeps going, by the fourth one, I'll just be one of the guys in the cavalry. But they ended up luring him to do it with money. He made $250,000, which was the price of A Fistful of Dollars, the entire movie, 2 years earlier. And he also got a Ferrari out of the deal, so you can't beat that. And then Eli Wallach was hired to play Tuco, and Lee Van Cleef. Eli Wallach was also a little bit reluctant because he had just done Magnificent Seven a few years earlier and was like, well, should I do another Western? And so the producers took him to a screening room, started showing him clips from the first two Leone movies. And I guess within 5-10 minutes, he said, turn the projector off, I'm in. I want to be part of this. And he created, I think, one of the most indelible characters in Westerns. I mean, he probably has 10 or 20 times the dialogue that Clint Eastwood has in this movie. It's just so much fun to watch. And then, of course, you have Lee Van Cleef, who was no stranger to these spaghetti Westerns, playing Angel Eyes, the black-hatted villain in this. And I just find it, just as immensely entertaining movie that just keeps giving you more and more stuff, keeps building and building. It does not always follow narrative logic, like how all of a sudden Angel Eyes manages to become a corporal or the commander at a Civil War prison. It sort of defies logic. But then, part of that, I think, was that 15 minutes at least was cut for the American release. And in 2002, there was a restored extended cut that was released. I actually saw it at the Orpheum, which was really fun. I did not realize I was going to see it. And it restored all that footage, but it had not been dubbed into English at the time. So Eastwood and Wallach was still alive at the time, went into the studio and recorded dialogue for those scenes. And then they got like a Lee Van Cleef sound-alike to do Angel Eyes' parts. And it's very strange because, clearly you're listening to Eastwood and Wallach and they're two old men playing the 50 years younger versions of themselves. And it's interesting, as deleted scenes often are, but what you find is, like, it does explain some of the connections of, like, how the characters got from A to B or B to C, these extra scenes, but you don't really need them because this is all like this crazy fever dream of what the Old West was like anyway. So you don't need that. You don't need all the plot holes filled in, I don't think. It just moves from one great scene to another. And these three amazing characters. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is, I would say, is relatively speaking, because certainly the build at the beginning, Clint Eastwood is no angel. He leaves his partner to die in the desert. Although I do think there's something of a redemptive arc for him throughout this. Towards the end, There's that scene in the bombed out chapel where you sort of see him as the angel figure for the dying soldier. And, at the end, he does save Tuco, although not without messing with him a little bit first, which makes for that great ending. And my theory is that Leone had a very dim view of the human condition. And you especially see that in later movies like Once Upon a Time in the West, and this one sort of one-off movie that you don't see very much it's either called A Fistful of Dynamite or Duck You Sucker, which is probably, as a Western, it's even more expensive, and it has like literally thousands of extras in scenes set during the Spanish Civil War, and it's a really dark, it's sort of funny, but also very dark look at human nature, and I think Leone had that, and I think you can see this movie as sort of a look at Tuco as sort of the everyman, this sort of greedy, grasping, mercenary character, and then Angel Eyes and Blondie as sort of the angel and devil on his shoulders, kind of pulling him one way or the next, and he, aligns with one and then aligns with the other and goes back and forth, which of course sets up, that ending I mentioned, that three-way shootout, which is like the greatest shootout in cinema history. I remember watching it for the first time when I was a teenager. The local Fox station, when I grew up in Denver, had Clint Eastwood week once a year, and it was always Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday were the Leones, and then it was like Hang 'em High, High Plains Drifter after that, and that scene goes on and on where, I think it's like 5 minutes total where they're just in that ring, circling each other. The editing, gets closer and closer to just their eyes, and it's just flashing back and forth. And the central question is, who's going to draw on who? Like, is Tuco going to draw on Blondie? Is he going to draw on Angel Eyes? And I think that's sort of the essential question of the film, is like, is he going to go good or evil? But again, this is a relative question because this is a very violent film, and all three of these guys are pretty bad customers. But I think that's sort of an interesting shading to what is like a very, like I said, very entertaining film that has stood the test of time. I was just reading this afternoon that cemetery, which is called Sad Hill Cemetery in Spain, has been restored by fans. It had been built for the film and then kind of abandoned, but that stone circle remained. And so fans came to kind of restore it. And one of the things you could do is, if you can contribute a certain amount of money, you could buy your own headstone in the cemetery, which I thought was a great way to do it, and also a tribute to this film, which is full of black humor and gunslinging and stuff like that. So I hope you guys got a chance to watch it again on Netflix, or if you like me, you've seen it a dozen times already. I really think it's a very entertaining. It probably is my favorite Western. I mean, I love Unforgiven. The Searchers is obviously a classic, but in terms of just sheer rewatchability and entertainment value, it's really hard to beat. I mean, there's just so much going on minute to minute. So that's kind of my spiel. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on the film, whether you just saw it or you've seen it your whole life, and if you have any questions, I can do my best to answer them, or at least give you my take.
Go ahead and put up your hand, or put it up virtually, and we'll get you on there. And if you prefer to ask a question in the chat, go ahead and put it in the chat, and I can pass it on to Rob. Ron, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, I really haven't seen the movie in 20 years, so I don't remember a lot of the specifics, but the characters just made an incredible, indelible impact as stereotypes or as icons. And one of the main reasons that I like the movie is the music.
Oh, of course. Yes.
Just to have that theme going on, and
Yeah, no, Ennio Morricone. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I forgot to mention that. It's one of the most famous scores in film history. Very avant-garde and different for the time, and yeah, it's iconic. And the sort of weird coyote howls, I guess I would call them, coyote choir, and and that theme goes throughout the movie. And Quentin Tarantino is a huge fan of he said this movie is the greatest achievement in cinema history, and you see this movie's influence all over Quentin Tarantino's film, starting with A Three-Way Shootout and Reservoir Dogs, and then going into the westerns he did. But also he hired Morricone to do an original score for The Hateful Eight, and you can clearly see the Leone influences on that movie as well. But yeah, I mean, I hear that theme all the time in like basketball games and stuff. It's like your your on deck music and baseball games. And you ever seen Metallica, the hard rock band, in concert? That's the music they come out to. Actually, it's not that. It's the music that plays during that gunfight scene. I won't sing it here, but it's a great soundtrack from start to finish.
Who else? Karen, how about you?
I had decided might be good to see because I had never seen it before. Though I think I'd seen parts of it when it would be on TV when I was a girl. The second time around, I thought it was better than the first because Westerns can be good and Westerns can be boring.
Yeah. And I think they can be undervalued. Roger Ebert wrote a review of it when it came out in '66, and then he went back to it in 1968, and he said he gave it 3 stars when he first reviewed it, and then he went back and said, you know what? I think I wrote a 4-star review. I wrote a 3-star review of a 4-star movie, and that he said at the time he didn't realize, I think, that Westerns could also be great art. And so, because it's a genre film, and because excuse me, I think people do really either love or hate Westerns. Like you're either my dad and you were watching Westerns every Saturday and Sunday afternoon on AMC or TCM, or it's a genre that doesn't speak to you at all, I think. But in these cases, I think they're movies that really do something, different. Like they really push it over way over the top compared to American Westerns, especially at that time. I think where the 50s and 60s were starting to get more like revisionist Westerns, I think, and weren't the black hats and white hats of 40s and 50s Westerns, or John Wayne ones. And so I think it's that's why these films are so special.
And in college, I took classes on movies, and we saw Once Upon a Time in the West. And I think I saw one of the reviews about how wooden Clint Eastwood was, and Leone didn't really like Clint.
Is that right?
Or
well, one of
the things I read yesterday was.
Yeah.
And
one thing was they couldn't communicate with each other because Leone didn't speak English and Eastwood didn't speak Italian, so they always went through interpreters, which was true of all the American actors that Leone worked with, except Eli Wallach, who spoke French fluently, and so did Sergio Leone, and they would speak to each other through French, and they were able to communicate that way. But you got to think for Eastwood, that's you are a stranger in a strange land. Even if you're making these great films, it's got to be a little bit tiring. Leone did want him back for Once Upon a Time in the West, which was his 4th one, but Eastwood was sort of done with the spaghetti westerns and wanted to get back to America, where he was now more of a movie star because of these movies. Was starting to get offers for westerns like Hang 'em High or Coogan's Bluff, which is a modern day movie. He plays a cowboy in it, and start developing his own projects. Of course, became a director a few years after that, and learned a lot from what he saw watching Leone. And so Charles Bronson, I think, took the role that that Leone was thinking of Eastwood for.
Yeah, I remember Bronson being just so, that magnetism that Clint Eastwood brings in magnetism. I don't know if he brings in a lot of range as an actor, but.
Right, which I think is like works in his favor in these movies because he just has this iconic cool, and especially when he's surrounded by so many like operatic characters like Tuco or the villains in the first two movies. He just is like so calm and centered, and maybe that is because that's all he could do on screen, but Leone sure used it well in those movies.
Yeah, when I was young, I worked at YWCA in Pasadena, and they were shooting scenes for one of those orangutan movies.
Oh, really? Yeah, Everybody Save the Blues? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was the second one, and they were using the front area, which was a residential where women could stay, apartments, and somebody went up to the front and snuck in, and he could never hit the mark and say the line.
Is that right?
Like 3 days of never hitting the mark and saying the line.
I think he was also the director on that one too. So
I did not go when I was working. I did not go up to the front to try and see what was happening up there. I just figured it was too nutsy.
Well, that's funny you say that because Eastwood as a director is known for moving very fast in his movies and doing like one take and just moving on, and not being a perfectionist at all, I think, but just keeping things moving. So that's interesting that he couldn't hit his own takes when he was the actor, I think.
Yeah. But that's the impression that my friend has who's snuck up there.
Yeah.
Because they are very, when I started reading about, and talking about how operatic it is and how Marconi, he always is giving people musical themes that a character is coming on, a song is coming,
right?
Introducing him, and then all the really deep focus, just the detail in the shots, how beautiful those are.
Right. I think that's something sort of operatic too, the way characters have themes. You see that with the Once Upon a Time in the West, which I think like pushes some of these themes almost to the breaking point. Like the first scene in it is like almost a half hour long where nothing happens. Like these three outlaws are waiting for a train to arrive, and he just pushes the suspense, almost to the breaking point. But it ends up being such a great movie. That'd be another great one to do. But that was his style. I mean, he made these. He didn't hold back in these movies, I think, and
like when I was watching them, the Union and the Confederate soldiers fighting over the bridge, I thought of, this reminds me of like the King of Hearts, where the battle comes and everybody's shooting everybody and everybody's dying, and the other characters the witnessing characters are just like, whoa.
Yeah. I
sort of thought, how much is he drawing from movies of that time?
Yeah, or even like a Vietnam allegory as well. I think it was 1966, so Vietnam was just heating up. I think the quote I wrote down from Blondie in that scene is, "I've never seen so many men wasted so badly," which I think was definitely Leone's perspective on war, which you see really played out in Duck You Sucker, where you just have thousands of, just these slaughterhouses of war and extremely violent, which is probably why that movie is not well known in the United States. It did not travel well and then got chopped up. And
No Yeah, I'm not sure if you saw in the comments there, Rob, that there is a question asking if this is one of the first movies to use the theme music throughout. Also, noting that it was the Civil War music was really sentimental.
Yeah. I don't know if it was one of the first. I mean, it uses music as Karen said, like a character, very much throughout the movie. I think other movies have themes. I mean, think of Psycho or something like that. But I think this is the first time that you have the music tied to a certain character. And the other thing I would say about the Civil War music is it's a very sentimental theme, but like that theme that scene in the camp where Tuco is being tortured by Angel Eyes, and they play that which is a really rough scene, and I guess was cut for the international release, is cut against the prisoners singing the choir outside. I mean, there's almost an irony to that sentimentality that Leone is using there, I think.
I feel like that references is that a Fellini movie where that happens in too?
Oh, I don't know.
It's like I recognize that whole the band playing, the orchestra playing, and the beautiful music covering up the sounds of people being murdered and tortured. And what movie does that reference?
No.
It's like it references something.
Huh. I'll look into that. Yeah, I don't know. One other thing I should mention is that if you look at clues, you can tell that this is actually a prequel to the other two spaghetti westerns. That most notably, Clint Eastwood, Blondie, finds his iconic poncho. He takes it from the dead soldier in that chapel. And there's a couple other hints that suggest that this movie chronologically is supposed to come before the other two, which is interesting.
Mm.
Rob, there's another question here. Have you talked much about the character of Tuco? So fascinating. This is from Nanette. Of the three characters, he's the most interesting to me. And just for the record, not at all ugly. It's a great part for any actor, and you can see Eli Wallach is really having fun with it. I read somewhere that he was nearly killed 3 times during the making of the film. Imagine. Any comments about Tuco or Wallach's portrayal of him?
Yeah, I mean, Tuco, like I said, I love as a character. I mean, because he is, you know who Eastwood is. You know who Angel Eyes is, the good guy, the bad guy. Tuco is the guy in the middle. He's scrapping. He's trying to figure out, which way he's going to go. I mean, you get more of a backstory with him, with his brother, the priest, and a little bit of tragedy there, but he's also, a schemer. And gosh, Wallach just has the best time with that role. I mean, he's so much fun to watch. And yeah, I agree. He's not ugly, I guess. I would say Lee Van Cleef is probably, an uglier character than Eli Wallach's is. But I sort of thought that the calling him ugly was Leone's way of saying, like, that's us. That's the everyman who's caught between these, two forces. But there's so much humor that Eli Wallach brings to it, like the scene when he's taking the bath, and if you're going to shoot, don't talk, and so much emotion he brings to it. I think it's such a great performance, and a character I don't think I see a lot in westerns in general. That character who, other than sort of a supporting role or a comic relief role, and here he's elevated to the same level as the good guy and the bad guy. That's a good point.
Without him, I don't think the movie would have worked very well.
Well, it would have been more traditional, I think. Good guys and bad guys. But yeah, it adds this complexity to it, I think. Yeah.
What about the level of violence that we'll see in something? Because I was also thinking about, the series Game of Thrones, where there's high levels of violence, and the characters just being sort of caricatures, like this movie is the caricatures, and and how that sort of, that was then, and we're still seeing stuff like that now. Well, even more slickly produced.
Right. Well, I know at the time, a lot of critics, critics weren't that over the moon. American critics weren't over the moon for this movie when it first came out. And the New York Times critic in particular signaled out for its violence and was like, because, remember, the Western is still a genre in America, which is like, good guys and bad guys and playing things pretty straight in the studio system. And here's a sweaty, bloody movie with all these scenes. I think the New York Times critic called it the burn, the gouge, and the mangle instead of the good, the bad, and the ugly, and just hated the violence in it. And I think that was quite a shock for people at that time.
So wasn't it kind of an over-the-top satire?
I don't know if I would say satire. Like I said, I would say, operette. I don't, like, how do you see it as a satire?
Well, it just
I
seems
say
like,
heightened, but still connected to the real thing.
it just seems to me that everything was exaggerated and over the top.
Very true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. And I don't know if I would say, I don't know if he's commenting on the Western genre, like he, so much as he's just using it and just, amping it up way beyond anything anybody was doing.
And it seemed to me that they were just kind of playing with the movie or with themselves and just having a good time, as it were.
I think that's probably true. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. Anybody else?
How long after this was the age of Westerns over, Rob? I'm not sure at what point that I mean, you'll see some of them made every now and then, but
yeah, I think it was kind of, they still, you see like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it sort of shifted to TV a lot in the late 60s and early 70s. And Eastwood kind of kept them going with like High Plains Drifter. But then there's probably a good, 20 years. Well, yeah, probably 20 years before Unforgiven in 1992. And there's always be, a revival of, on TV or something like that. Every now and then somebody tries to revive them. But I think, I do think this kind of came at the end of what we would think of as sort of the natural run for the genre. I heard somebody say that like superhero movies are our new Westerns now, which I sort of agree. True. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So there'll probably be a Leone superhero movie coming. maybe the Deadpool movies are like that. I don't know. But I would say, this did come at the end. Perhaps it was the Vietnam War kind of gave people, not that interested in going to see these stories anymore, or what it was, I think. But, as the 70s came and it sort of shifted to these more naturalistic movies like, by Coppola or, Scorsese, I think they kind of fell out of favor.
But then Scorsese can be quite savage too.
What's that?
Scorsese can be quite over the top
right.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess for me, it's more thinking of the Western as like the genre of clear-cut good guys and bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
That was something that, a lot of 70s filmmakers were rebelling against. Just in general, also like cop movies or whatever. They're looking for more moral grays. And while you definitely see Westerns that have that, some of the best ones, certainly Unforgiven would be one of them. So the traditional Western, I think, was maybe thought of as uncool by that generation of filmmakers. You know, your
Yeah.
dad. Those are your dad's movies,
The 50s and the 60s and
right? Yeah, the John Ford, the Howard Hawks. You know,
well, yeah.
John Wayne did not like Clint Eastwood. That's a great Western as well. John Wayne's The Shootout, 1976. That one was probably the nail in the coffin, I think, of the Western for a long time, which is a great sort of movie about an old gunslinger, sort of his last hurrah. Then John Wayne died, I think, 4 years after that, but that was his last Western. And that kind of put the period on the Western as a genre for quite a while.
You know, it seems like there was a lot of competition or jealousy between the various actors, as who's going to get what billing and which name goes first, and
Oh, yeah.
you know, all of that. It's awfully petty, with whether you get a Ferrari or not, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to read that, and like, you know, even today, like all these negotiations on whose name goes above the title,
yeah.
you know, how they go across the top above the title, and it's really interesting
I think
how much weight is put on that. Yeah,
it's always like that.
right.
Yeah.
Turns out that Hollywood actors have pretty big egos. It turns out.
Yeah, I bet.
Who knew? Yeah.
Right.
How do you make it in a business like that without a big ego?
Right. That's probably true because, you know, especially when you're starting out, you have, you know, 100 people saying no to you before one says yes. You better believe in yourself because nobody else in Hollywood does. And then as soon as you know, get any kind of success, you're probably worried about losing it and the guy is coming up behind you. So
And just getting financing together for something like that, and
yeah,
people together at the right time. And
This has been interesting, but I've got to go.
okay.
So, until next time.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks much for everybody. Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron. Good to see you.
See you, Chris.
Yeah. Should we wrap up, Chris, or do you think we get more questions in?
I'm not seeing any in the comments, but go ahead and feel free to fire them along. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you, Rob, was there any, at the time the movie came out, or at the time that Spaghetti Westerns came out, was there any commentary, criticism about, you know, casting people who were clearly not from the U.S. or not in these roles where they were supposed to be Native Americans, to be Latinos? What was the?
Well, there was a lot of that
issue then.
There's a lot of that in Hollywood. Well, it was done a lot in Hollywood Westerns. I think now you look back on that kind of casting, and I mean, Magnificent Seven, which I brought up, is a great example of that. You know, I think that the spaghetti westerns were different because so few of them made it to America. They were all, you know, I mean, these ones did, but there were hundreds more that just played in European theaters and were sort of playing, you know, and so I don't think there was the same thought. I mean, these movies like would have different actors from different countries, and they would all just talk in their native language, and then it would all be dubbed into Italian or English or French or whatever. Fine, Annette. Yeah. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I think they weren't thinking too much about representation because, you know, they weren't even bothered to get people from the same country, let alone having the right demographics represented, you know.
But by the 60s, were Westerns more popular in Europe than they were in the U.S.? I mean,
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, American movies certainly were very popular in Europe. I mean, you know, and, you know, the new wave in some way was playing with some of the conventions of American movies. And so I think as they were sort of waning in popularity here, Western specifically, there was this, you know, surge in interest in Europe, but also, you know, these movies were very cheaply made in Europe, so they didn't have to do very well to turn a profit, I think. You know, and they were just pumping out dozens and dozens of them that were not very good. I mean, you know, most of them, and which is probably why they never made it to America.
Were they non-union actors and extras? Is that what
I
made
think,
it
yeah, I think
expensive?
especially when they're shooting it. I think whether it's shot in Spain was it was so cheap. You know, these great locations, and yeah, I'm not sure, but I mean, I got the feeling, you know, if you're making a movie for even in 1964 for $250,000, you know, a full Western, you're not paying people very well at all. So, yeah.
Chris, I have a
Hey, Meg.
question.
Go ahead, Meg.
One of the things that surprised me about the movie, and by the way, I'd never seen it before, was the length. I mean, it's a very long movie.
Yes.
How do you think the movie would change if it were edited into the length of movie that we are used to seeing today? How would it change the movie?
I mean, to me, and you know, it wouldn't have the richness, I don't think. I mean, you need just all, you know, everything that happens, the slow build, all the different set pieces that go through. You know, if you cut, you know, like I said, they cut 20 minutes already for the international release. To cut like another 45 to get it into 2 hours, I think you would lose a lot. And you know, and that's something Leone has dealt with his whole career. I mean, in the 80s, he made a gangster movie called Once Upon a Time in America with Robert De Niro and James Woods, I think, is in it. It was a 4-hour movie. I mean, it was, you know, and it got cut to, I think, 2 hours for the American release, and it was incomprehensible, basically, you know. I mean, he just tells these big, sweeping stories and refuses to chop them down. Although, I mean, the first two, For a Few Dollars More and Fistful of Dollars, are like 2-hour movies. But he increasingly wanted to make these big canvas movies. And so I think, you know, you could go back to the script level, I think, and make a 2-hour version of this and then shoot that would work. But I think just editing the finished product down to 2 hours, I don't think that would work very well. I think you'd lose. I mean, it's already a little hard to follow from moment to moment. I think it would be really hard to follow, you know, without a lot of that. And you just miss a lot of it. So, but yeah, you're right. It's a long movie. There's no question.
In the original, was there an intermission?
There must have been at 3 hours, right? I don't know. I miss intermissions, I gotta say. Well, I miss going to the movies, but also I miss intermissions.